In the remote mountains of Hokkaido, scientists made a discovery that sent shockwaves through the archaeological world. Inside ancient burial sites, they found DNA that shouldn't exist. Genetic signatures from people who lived in Japan for 14,000 years, but were systematically erased from history. What if I told you that the ancestors of modern Japan aren't who you think they are? That hidden beneath the official story lies a network of ghost populations. Ancient peoples whose DNA still flows through Japanese veins, but whose existence was deliberately forgotten. In 2024, a team of geneticists analyzing 115 ancient skeletons made a discovery so shocking, it forced them to question everything we thought we knew about human migration in East Asia. The DNA they found belonged to not one, not two, but at least 4 distinct phantom populations. This is the story of Japan's ghost ancestors. And what we've discovered about them will change everything you thought you knew about human migration, genetic survival, and the true origins of the Japanese people. Because these genetic phantoms aren't just Japan's secret. They might be the key to understanding the hidden history of humanity itself. Dr. Hideaki Kanzawa-Kiriyama stared at the computer screen in disbelief. Mitochondrial DNA analysis of 115 Edo-period skeletons from Hokkaido had just returned results that defied every established theory about Japanese population genetics. For decades, scientists believed that Ainu people were direct descendants of the Jomon, Japan's original inhabitants. The data on his screen told a completely different story. Only 31% of the genetic material matched known Jomon signatures. The rest was a genetic puzzle that would take years to solve. The skeletons came from across Hokkaido, from Bairotori, the Central Highlands, to coastal settlements along the Sea of Okhotsk. Each site told the same impossible story. These weren't genetically homogeneous people. They were living mosaics of phantom populations. But here's what made the discovery truly groundbreaking. These skeletons dated to the Edo-period, 1603 to 1868 AD. This was before the Meiji government's mass settlement of Hokkaido in 1869. Before any official genetic mixing with mainland Japanese populations. Yet 28% of the DNA came from mainland Japanese sources. Someone had been lying about Japan's genetic timeline. The question was, who were these ghost ancestors, and how long had they been hiding in plain sight? 35% of the DNA belonged to something called the Okhotsk culture, a mysterious Siberian people who had vanished from the archaeological record by the 10th century. But this wasn't just any vanished culture. The Okhotsk people had left behind sophisticated hunting tools, elaborate spiritual artifacts, and evidence of complex trade networks stretching across the North Pacific. More intriguingly, they had practiced the same sacred bear ceremonies that would later become central to Ainu spirituality. Were the Okhotsk the true originators of Japan's most sacred indigenous practices? Had they been genetic and cultural ghosts all along? The fourth phantom? But the most shocking discovery was yet to come. 7% of the DNA came from an unknown Siberian source, a fourth ghost population that scientists still can't identify. These phantom ancestors had left their genetic fingerprints in Japanese DNA, but no archaeological trace anywhere. Who were these mysterious Siberians? When did they arrive in Japan? How did they contribute to the genetic fabric of the Japanese people? The DNA held the answers, but the people themselves remained complete ghosts, genetic phantoms, whose identity was locked in molecular code. To understand Japan's ghosts' ancestors, we have to journey back 14,000 years to the end of the last ice age. Japan was a very different place then, connected to the Asian mainland by land bridges, covered in vast forests and inhabited by some of humanity's most mysterious early peoples. The Jomon people arrived during this ancient world, but here's what's strange. They themselves are genetic enigmas. Their primary DNA signature, Y chromosome haplogroup D1b, is found almost nowhere else on Earth, except in tiny, isolated pockets. Think about this. The same genetic lineage appears in ancient Japan. The high plateaus of Tibet, the remote Andaman Islands in the Indian Ocean, and nowhere else. How did the same DNA signature end up scattered across such impossible distances? It's as if an ancient population was torn apart by some cataclysmic event, leaving only genetic fragments scattered across Asia like pieces of a broken mirror. The Jomon weren't just Japan's first inhabitants. They were survivors of something much larger and more mysterious. But the Jomon weren't primitive survivors, scratching out a living in post-glacial Japan. They were master craftsmen who created some of the world's oldest pottery minus 16,000 years ago, when most of the world was still using stone tools and living in caves. Their pottery wasn't just functional, it was art, elaborate chord-marked patterns, flame-like decorations, and complex geometric designs that suggest sophisticated aesthetic sensibilities and possibly spiritual beliefs we can only guess at. Even more remarkably, the Jomon built permanent settlements and lived sedentary lives, something that was unsupposed to be possible for hunter-gatherer societies. They had complex social structures, elaborate burial practices, and trade networks that stretched across the entire Japanese archipelago. Their dogu figurines, mysterious clay sculptures with alien-like features, suggest spiritual beliefs of stunning complexity. Were these representations of deities' ancestors? Shamanic visions? We may never know, but they hint at a sophisticated culture that flourished for over 10,000 years. But perhaps most mysteriously, the Jomon maintained their genetic distinctiveness for millennia. While other populations mixed and merged across Asia, the Jomon remained genetically isolated on their island archipelago, developing unique characteristics that would later puzzle European researchers. This isolation created something unprecedented, a population that evolved in genetic isolation for over 10,000 years, developing unique physical characteristics, cultural practices, and possibly even cognitive adaptations we're only beginning to understand. Yet somehow, these master craftsmen and their descendants would become Japan's first ghost ancestors. By 1000 BC, something was changing in the Japanese archipelago. New peoples were arriving from the mainland, bringing new technologies, new ways of life, and new genetic signatures that would forever alter the Jomon world. The Jomon didn't disappear overnight, they became genetic ghosts. Their DNA preserved in isolated populations, while their culture slowly faded from the archaeological record. They were the first of Japan's phantom ancestors, but they wouldn't be the last. Around 1000 BC, everything changed. The Yayoi people arrived from the Korean peninsula in mainland China, bringing with them the most revolutionary technology in human history, agriculture. But this wasn't just cultural exchange, it was genetic replacement on a massive scale. The Yayoi brought wet trice agriculture, bronze and iron metallurgy, and complex social hierarchies. They were organized, numerous, and technologically superior. Within a few centuries, they had transformed Japan from a hunter-gatherer society into an agricultural civilization. But the real transformation was genetic. The Yayoi carried Y chromosome haplogroup 0, completely different from the Jomon's D1b lineage. As they spread across Japan, they didn't just introduce new technologies, they introduced new genes. In most of Japan, the Yayoi genetic signature gradually became dominant. The Jomon populations were absorbed, displaced, or simply died out. But in the remote northern islands, something different happened. Hokkaido and the northern territories became a refuge for Jomon populations. The harsh climate, difficult terrain, and distance from the mainland created a natural barrier that the Yayoi couldn't easily cross. Here, the descendants of the Jomon survived, but they didn't survive unchanged. Isolated populations are vulnerable to genetic drift, environmental pressures, and contact with new peoples. The Jomon descendants in the north would encounter new ghost populations that would fundamentally alter their genetic makeup. By the 7th century AD, the northern Jomon descendants had evolved into something new, the Satsuman culture. They had adopted some Yayoi technologies, pottery styles, metal tools, even some agricultural practices, but maintained their fundamental hunting and gathering lifestyle. The Satsuman weren't just surviving Jomon, they were genetic and cultural bridges between the ancient hunter-gatherer past and the emerging Ainu identity. They were ghost ancestors in transition, carrying forward ancient genetic legacies while adapting to new realities. But here's where the story gets complicated. The 2024 genetic study revealed that mainland Japanese genetic material had been infiltrating northern populations for centuries, long before any official contact. How is this possible? The answer lies in something historians have long underestimated: ancient trade networks. The northern territories weren't completely isolated. They were connected to the mainland through complex trade relationships that brought not just goods, but people. This wasn't invasion, it was osmosis. Small numbers of mainland Japanese traders, refugees, and adventurers were gradually integrating into northern populations. Their genetic contributions were small but cumulative, creating hybrid populations that no official history recorded. By the time the Edo period arrived, these northern populations were already genetic mosaics. The 28% mainland Japanese DNA found in Edo period. Ainu wasn't from recent contact. It was the accumulated result of centuries of invisible genetic exchange. While the Jomon were evolving into the Satsuman in southern Hokkaido, something entirely different was happening along the northern coasts. Between the 5th and 13th centuries, a mysterious people known as the Okhotsk culture dominated the sea routes of the North Pacific. The Okhotsk weren't just another prehistoric culture. They were master mariners who controlled sea routes from Sakhalin to the Kurils. They hunted whales, seals, and sea lions with sophisticated harpoon technology that wouldn't be matched for centuries. Their boats were marvels of engineering, skin-covered vessels that could handle the brutal North Pacific storms. They built permanent settlements along coastlines, developed complex social hierarchies, and created trade networks that connected Siberia to Japan. But perhaps most remarkably, they practiced elaborate spiritual ceremonies centered around marine mammals. The bear ceremony that would later become central to Ainu spirituality, the Okhotsk were performing nearly identical rituals centuries earlier. The 2024 genetic study revealed that the Okhotsk weren't just cultural influences, they were genetic contributors on a massive scale. 35% of Edo-period Ainu DNA came from Okhotski sources, making them the largest single genetic component outside of the Jomon. But how did this happen? The Okhotsk and the developing Ainu populations weren't just neighbors. They were actively interacting through trade, intermarriage, and cultural exchange. The Okhotsk were becoming genetic ghosts even as they remained culturally distinct. The most intriguing connection was spiritual. Both the Okhotsk and later Ainu practiced elaborate bear ceremonies, rituals where captured bear cubs were raised, honored, and then sacrificed to send their spirits back to the divine realm. These weren't just similar ceremonies, they were virtually identical in structure, meaning, and execution. This suggests either direct cultural transmission or shared spiritual origins that go back centuries before the Ainu identity fully formed. But by the 10th century, the Okhotsk culture was in rapid decline. The Satsuman culture, ancestors of the Ainu, were expanding northward. Climate change was altering sea routes. Trade networks were disrupting. Unlike other conquered peoples, the Okhotsk didn't just disappear, they dissolved. Their settlements were abandoned, their distinctive pottery styles vanished, and their cultural practices were absorbed into the developing Ainu identity. But genetics tells a different story. The Okhotsk didn't disappear, they became invisible. Their DNA persisted in northern populations. Their spiritual practices were integrated into Ainu culture, and their maritime knowledge became part of the Ainu skill set. The Okhotsk were the most successful ghost ancestors of all. They achieved genetic immortality by becoming part of another culture entirely. Their genes survived even as their identity vanished from history. But the genetic puzzle wasn't complete. 7% of Edo-period Ainu DNA came from a source that scientists still can't identify. These weren't Jomon Okhotsk or mainland Japanese genes. They were something else entirely. The closest matches were found in modern Siberian populations, but even these were distant relatives. Whoever these phantom ancestors were, they had left their genetic fingerprints in Japanese DNA, but no archaeological trace anywhere. The clues point to ancient Siberia, the vast expanse of northern Asia, that has been home to countless nomadic peoples over millennia. But Siberia is enormous, and its archaeological record is fragmentary at best. Could these phantom ancestors be related to the Paleo-Siberian peoples? The ancestors of the Chukchi, the Ivan, the Niv? Or were they something even more ancient? A ghost population that vanished before leaving any archaeological evidence. The only clue might be hidden in the Ainu language itself. Ainu is a complete linguistic isolate. It has no verified relatives anywhere in the world. But some linguists detect faint echoes of ancient Siberian languages in its structure. If these linguistic connections are real, The Ainu language might be the last surviving voice of the fourth phantom population, a genetic ghost that speaks through words rather than bones. How did these phantom ancestors reach Japan? The most likely route would have been through the Kuril Islands and Sakhalin. It's the same sea routes later used by the Okhotsk culture. But this would have required sophisticated maritime technology and navigation skills. Were these phantom ancestors ancient mariners who island hopped across the North Pacific? Were they refugees from some forgotten conflict in Siberia? Or were they something else entirely? A population so ancient that they predate our current archaeological understanding? The genetic signatures these phantoms left behind are tantalizing but incomplete. They include mitochondrial DNA haplogroups that are rare in modern populations, but appear in ancient samples from across northern Asia. This suggests that the fourth phantom population might have been part of a much larger ancient network of peoples who once inhabited northern Asia, but have since vanished or been absorbed into other populations. Today, geneticists are using advanced DNA analysis and growing databases of ancient samples to try to identify these phantom ancestors. Every new archaeological discovery in Siberia could potentially solve the mystery. But until then, the fourth phantom population remains the most mysterious of Japan's ghost ancestors. A genetic signature without a face. A DNA pattern without a people, a molecular ghost that haunts the genetic landscape of Japan. The 2024 study that revealed Japan's ghost ancestors didn't just rewrite Ainu history, it demolished the entire scientific framework that had dominated population genetics for decades. The dual structure model, accepted by scientists worldwide, was suddenly obsolete. For 50 years, scientists had believed that modern Japanese populations were formed by the mixing of two groups, the indigenous Jomon and the immigrant Yayoi. The Ainu were thought to be pure Jomon descendants who had avoided this mixing, but the genetic evidence was undeniable. The Ainu weren't pure Jomon descendants. They were complex genetic mosaics formed by at least 4 distinct populations. If the Ainu were this genetically complex, what did that mean for the rest of Japan? The implications were staggering. If Japan's supposedly pure indigenous population was actually a mixture of ghost ancestors, then the entire concept of genetic purity in East Asia needed to be reconsidered. The study revealed something even more remarkable. The genetic contributions weren't evenly distributed. In southwestern Hokkaido, 37% of the DNA came from mainland Japanese sources. In central areas, 44% was Jomon. The Okhotsk contribution was consistent across regions at about 35%. This suggested that genetic mixing wasn't random. It followed geographic and cultural patterns that reflected centuries of complex population interactions. The ghost ancestors hadn't mixed uniformly. They had created genetic landscapes that mirrored historical and cultural boundaries. Perhaps the most shocking discovery was the extent of mainland Japanese genetic influence. 28% of Edo-period Ainu DNA came from mainland sources. This wasn't recent mixing, it was ancient integration that had been happening for centuries. This meant that the story of Japanese genetic isolation was false. There had been continuous genetic exchange between the mainland and the northern territories for much longer than anyone had realized. The ghost ancestors included not just exotic populations, but familiar ones whose ancient presence had been forgotten. But the study also revealed the limitations of genetic archaeology. The analysis focused on mitochondrial DNA genetic material inherited only through the maternal line. This represents only a tiny fraction of total genetic variation. What about the paternal lineages? What about the nuclear DNA that makes up the bulk of genetic variation? Ghost ancestors revealed by mitochondrial DNA might be just the tip of the iceberg. Today, scientists are using next-generation sequencing techniques to analyze entire genomes from ancient samples. These techniques are revealing even more complexity in ancient populations and suggesting that ghost ancestors might be the rule rather than the exception. Every new study reveals more phantom populations, more genetic complexity, and more evidence that the neat categories we use to understand human populations are inadequate for describing the messy reality of genetic history. But the story of Japan's ghost ancestors isn't just about ancient genetics. It's about modern politics. The Japanese government didn't just ignore genetic diversity. It actively tried to erase it from both policy and memory. The 1899 Hokkaido Former Aborigines Protection Act had an Orwellian name. It was undesigned to protect the Ainu, but to eliminate them as a distinct people. The ghost ancestors were to be forgotten not just by history, but by their own descendants. Children were forbidden from speaking Ainu. Sacred tattoos were banned. Traditional names were replaced with Japanese ones. Hunting and gathering practices were outlawed. The bear ceremony, a spiritual practice that connected the Ainu to their Okhotsk ghost ancestors, was declared illegal. This wasn't just assimilation. It was cultural genocide designed to sever the connection between the Ainu and their phantom ancestors. The genetic diversity that had taken millennia to develop was to be erased within a single generation. The cultural erasure went hand in hand with economic exploitation. Japanese government seized vast tracts of Hokkaido land, the ancestral territories where the ghost ancestors had lived and died for millennia. The Ainu were forced to become farmers on marginal land, while Japanese settlers claimed the fertile valleys and rich fishing grounds. The economic foundation that had supported the descendants of the ghost ancestors for thousands of years was destroyed in decades. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of the erasure was historical. For decades, Japanese textbooks portrayed Japan as an ethnically homogeneous nation. The Ainu were written out of history entirely, and the ghost ancestors became literally invisible. Children grew up believing that Japan had always been genetically uniform, that the Yamato people were the only true Japanese, and that genetic diversity was a foreign concept. The ghost ancestors were erased, not just from policy, but from memory itself. The suppression was so effective that many Ainu began hiding their heritage. Children were taught to deny their ancestry, to claim Japanese identity, and to forget the genetic legacy of their phantom ancestors. By the mid-20th century, the erasure had nearly succeeded. The ghosts' ancestors were becoming actual ghosts as their descendants forgot who they were and where they came from. Even the academic establishment was complicit. Research into Ainu genetics was discouraged. Funding was limited, and findings that contradicted the homogeneous Japan narrative were suppressed or ignored. The ghost ancestors were being erased not just from popular culture, but from scientific inquiry itself. The very tools that could have revealed their existence were being deliberately blunted. The erasure was so complete that it fooled the international community. Foreign textbooks repeated the myth of Japanese homogeneity. Anthropologists accepted the simplified population models, and the ghost ancestors remained hidden from global scientific scrutiny. The phantom populations weren't just invisible in Japan, they were invisible to the world. The genetic diversity that the 2024 study revealed had been hiding in plain sight for over a century. But genetics has a way of revealing hidden truths. As DNA analysis technology advanced in the 21st century, scientists began to uncover genetic signatures that the Japanese government had tried to erase. The 2008 official recognition of the Ainu as indigenous people was just the beginning. Advanced genetic analysis was about to reveal that the Ainu were unjust indigenous. They were living libraries of Japan's phantom ancestors. The creation of global genetic databases and international scientific collaboration made it possible to compare ancient Japanese DNA with populations from across Asia. For the first time, scientists could trace the genetic signatures of the ghost ancestors. Every new study revealed more complexity, more phantom populations, and more evidence that the simple stories told about Japanese genetics were inadequate for describing the messy reality of genetic history. The real breakthrough came with advances in ancient DNA extraction and analysis. Scientists could now recover genetic material from bones that were thousands of years old, allowing them to directly study the ghost ancestors, rather than just their living descendants. The 115 Edo-period skeletons analyzed in the 2024 study were just the beginning. Each new ancient sample added pieces to the puzzle of Japan's phantom populations. Parallel to the genetic renaissance was a cultural revival. Young Ainu began learning their ancestral language. Traditional crafts were being taught again, and the bear ceremony, banned for over a century, was being performed openly. The ghost ancestors were being resurrected not just in genetic databases, but in living culture. The spiritual practices that connected the Ainu to their Okhotsk ancestors were being restored after generations of suppression. Japanese education was slowly beginning to acknowledge genetic diversity. New textbooks mentioned the Ainu university courses explored population genetics, and the myth of Japanese homogeneity was finally being challenged. The ghost ancestors were emerging from academic obscurity into mainstream consciousness. The phantom populations were becoming real people with real contributions to Japanese heritage. The international academic community was beginning to recognize the complexity of Japanese population genetics. The 2024 study was published in leading journals, presented at major conferences, and cited as a paradigm-shifting discovery. The ghost ancestors of Japan were no longer just a local curiosity. They were becoming a case study in how genetic archaeology could reveal hidden population histories worldwide. So who are the ghost ancestors of Japan? They're not just the Ainu, not just the Jomon, not just any single population. A Aryan network of phantom peoples whose genetic signatures reveal the true complexity of human migration and survival. They're the 14,000-year-old Jomon master potters whose mysterious DNA signature appears in scattered populations across Asia. They're the maritime Okhotsk Siberians, who brought bear ceremonies and spiritual practices that survived their cultural extinction. They're the ancient mainland Japanese who quietly integrated into northern populations for centuries before any official contact, and they read the fourth phantom population, the unknown. Siberians whose genetic signature persists in Japanese DNA, but whose identity remains locked in molecular code. These ultimate ghost ancestors represent the vast unknown of human genetic history. Every person of Japanese descent carries the DNA of these phantom populations. In their genes flows the genetic river of ancient Asia. Hunter-gatherers, mariners, farmers, and nomads whose individual stories have been lost, but whose collective legacy survives. But the real revelation isn't about Japan, it's about humanity itself. As genetic archaeology advances, we're discovering ghost ancestors everywhere. Every population, every nation, every ethnic group carries the genetic signatures of phantom peoples. The Celtic peoples of Europe carry DNA from mysterious pre-Indo-European populations. Native Americans descend from at least 3 distinct Asian migrations. Africans carry genetic signatures from dozens of ancient peoples whose names we'll never know. The ghost ancestors of Japan are destroying the simple stories we tell about human populations. There are no pure peoples, no unmixed populations, no genetic islands. We're all products of phantom ancestors, living libraries of extinct peoples whose stories are written in our DNA. The official histories, the national narratives, the ethnic identities, they are all just stories. We tell ourselves to make sense of genetic complexity that defies simple categorization. In our genes, we're all connected to phantom populations. The genetic material that makes us human comes from countless ghost ancestors, whose individual contributions may be small, but whose collective impact is enormous. The Jomon potter, who created the world's first ceramics 16,000 years ago, is genetically connected to the Tibetan nomad, the Andaman islander, and the Japanese salary worker. The Okhotsk mariner, who hunted whales in the Sea of Okhotsk, shares genetic material with modern Siberians, Ainu, and Japanese. But the story of Japan's ghost ancestors is far from over. Every new genetic study reveals more phantom populations, more complexity, and more evidence that the simple stories we tell about human populations are inadequate for describing the messy reality of genetic history. Thanks for watching.